this month's practice-based research seminar. We've got 3 fabulous speakers today. We're going to kick off with Hannah Lane in a minute, who's going to tell us a bit about her experience on the integrated clinical academic pathway. And then James Faraday will be talking about his project about improving mealtimes for people with dementia. And Susan Guthrie is our final speaker today, and she's going to share some information from her literature review on mealtime difficulties from the perspective of adults with mental health difficulties. And the presentation just seems to have gone from my screen. I'm not quite sure why. Something's happened with my picture. Oh, so we'll just wait for Helen to rejoin the call because she's got the presentation on her computer. Just while we're waiting for Helen to rejoin, just a bit of housekeeping. So if you've got any questions for the presenters, please drop them into the chat box, and we'll pose them to the presenters at the end of each presentation. We've also asked the presenters to share their contact details on their presentation. So if you've got any questions or follow-up, then please do contact them directly. James, the first half of the seminar today, so Hannah and James's presentations, will be recorded and added to the RCSLT YouTube channel, where you can catch up on all the other seminars that we've hosted since last June. And Susan is hoping to publish her review, so her presentation won't be recorded today. Okay, so we'll just give it another couple of minutes and we'll get going.
Hi guys, I hope you can all hear me. I should be able to control the screen. I'm just going to move forward. It doesn't have the arrows like it did in our test run.
Do you want to try again, Hannah?
Yeah, I'll try now. Nope, doesn't seem to be moving for me. Oh, did you just do that for me?
That might have been Helen.
Okay, yes. We'll just go with it. Helen, you might need to move it on for me. Sorry, the arrows aren't coming up and nothing's working on my keyboard. Okay, hi everyone. Yes, so Can we go back to the first one, please? Yeah, lovely. So yes, I'm here today just to talk about my journey so far on the National Institute of Health Research and Health Education England Integrated Clinical Academic Pathway. It's a mouthful. It takes my entire slot just to say the name of it. I know that the two following speakers are going to be brilliant. They're talking about quite a specialist, really interesting research projects that they're both doing, but I'm quite new to this whole thing and I don't really have a project in its entirety to present to you, but I'm just going to talk about my journey and hopefully give anyone some tips if they're thinking about starting on this pathway, and just go through my experience really. Okay, so I'm going to be like Chris Whitty and say next slide please. Yep, so one of the things that I'm really missing about the face-to-face meetings and workshops is that time in coffee breaks where you just get to network and get to know people. So I'm just really going to quickly let you know some things about me. So I'm a Yorkshire girl, born and bred. I'm from York and I live in Sheffield. I studied my undergrad speech and language therapy degree at Birmingham City University. I qualified in 2016. I'm a paediatric speech and language therapist, so pre-COVID my days would be made up with Pop-Up Pirate and Bubbles. Currently they're made up with trying to work Zoom or Accurix. I do like a glass of wine on a weekend. I'm an absolute chocoholic and I sometimes like to run mainly just to burn off the chocolate. Okay, next slide please. So I know that this has been covered in previous seminars, but if anyone's new today and isn't too aware of the Integrated Clinical Academic Programme, I just thought I'd quickly go through it. So you can imagine it a bit like a ladder, and it goes all the way up, as you see, to senior clinical lectureship. You don't need to start at the bottom. You can come in at any stage depending on your experience. I have started at the bottom. I did the internship in 2017 to 2018, and I currently hold the pre-doctoral clinical academic fellowship. I am hoping to go forward onto the CDRF. I don't know about the other two steps yet, maybe come back to me in a few years, but yes, that's what I'm hoping to do. Next slide, please. So the reasons for me starting this journey of clinical academia, I've always had an interest in research. I know it sounds really cliche, but I think I was the only one of my friends at university that actually enjoyed the dissertation side of things. And I've always kept up with the bulletin and research and everything like that. I kind of work in a community-based role, so I work with varying needs, but I have always wanted to develop a clinical specialism, and my interest is working with children with cleft palate. I'm the link therapist for Nottingham Trent, so I do some work with the cleft children through them, and I really enjoy working with them, but through my clinical practice, it did start raising some questions for me, like I know how much work the cleft services do and how much support these children get, and the fact that the surgery in this country is just improving all the time, and yet I was still seeing some young people at the age of 16 with speech sound difficulties, and it just got me thinking, I wonder if we could get some more evidence for that early intervention, whether we could limit the amount of speech and language therapy they may need and improve those speech outcomes. And I have to be honest as well, I absolutely just love clinical academia. When I was newly qualified and I was going to the Cleft Sens or any of the meetings or workshops, I just thought that clinical academics seemed like really reflective, proactive, open people, and I just really wanted to be part of it. Okay, next slide, please. So I started my internship in 2017. So the information that I give on the internship today may be out of date. I have recently supported a few people with their applications, so I think it's fairly similar as when I applied, but just double check. So my supervisor was Dr. Yvonne Wren. She is the director of Bristol Speech and Language Therapy Research Unit, and she's the chief investigator of the Cleft Collective cohort study. So obviously she sits really nicely in terms of my interest in cleft. I think one of the main points of advice I could give to anyone going into any stages of this programme, or any clinical academia really, is surround yourself with a really strong team, because they will be with you at your highs, but they'll also be there for your lows. And Yvonne wasn't the first person I spoke to about my research interests. It's amazing when you start talking to someone in the clinical academic field how everyone knows everyone, so they soon get you in touch with lots of other people as well. So I'd just get out there, I'd start talking to people, and although credentials are really important, I think you've got to have a really strong working relationship with that person as well. So just make sure that the right person for you really. And yeah, I just put some images in there to represent the different highs and lows of clinical academia. Okay, next slide please. So when I started out with my internship, I really wanted to run a randomised control trial to explore the impact of speech and language therapy delivered in the first year of life on the speech outcomes of children with cleft palate, which was great. And Yvonne went, yeah, that's fab. You have 38 days for this internship. And she very gently brought me back down to earth that that's really a doctoral, if not higher level project. So I'm still not working directly on that project yet. I'm just laying the foundations, pulling together a protocol, and getting ready for that in the future. So, but I think it's absolutely fine to think big, because when you apply for these schemes, they're wanting you to look forward in the future as well, and where you're going to take it. So I think it's absolutely fine. Okay, next slide, please. So what I actually did for my internship project, I did a literature review. I'll talk a little bit about that later on as well. I did some semi-structured interviews with the lead speech and language therapists of the cleft services, which was brilliant and really useful in terms of that networking as well. So Lucy Southby, who's the lead therapist of the Cambridge Cleft Centre, is now my clinical academic mentor, and she's just brilliant. So the text in black is what on paper I did through the internship, but actually the text in blue is what I learned and all the experiences I got. And I think sometimes with the internship, they make you feel like the emphasis is going to be on the project and on study, but actually what they want from it by the end is so you can reflect on what you've learned and how you've grown. So I think sometimes people put too much emphasis on the actual project for the internship, and really you want to be building your own experiences and your networks and everything like that. Okay, next slide, please. I think, as I've mentioned a few times before, networking is definitely key. It's something that I hold as probably the most important thing, even now in my PCAF. By the time I came to present my internship on a poster at a conference, I had more logos than I did text, which is a really good hint as well. If you don't have that much to say, just fill it with logos. So yeah, I've met so many brilliant people, and I've never met anyone in my journey that hasn't wanted to support me, even if they aren't that interested in the actual topic that I'm wanting to research. Clinical academics just want to support other clinical academics. That's very much been my experience. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm making it all sound like it's just absolutely perfect all the time. There's definitely some challenges, time constraints. I think everyone would say that, especially in a split clinical academic role, it can be really difficult to kind of finish clinical work and start research. I think one of the main errors that I've made starting the PCAF is I use my NHS emails for everything. So when I log on a PCAF day, I have clinical emails there as well, and it's so hard not to just go, oh, I'll just answer that one, I'll just answer that one, and before you know it, you've done half a day of clinical work instead. But I am getting better at that, but it's definitely a challenge. I've put travelling down because I live in Sheffield, Yvonne lives in Bristol, So obviously that has been a challenge before, but I've also put not traveling there because in hindsight now, I'd love to be able to go down and spend a week with her. So there's challenges on both ends. My secondary supervisor for the PCAF is based at University of Sheffield, Dr. Silke Fricke, and she's brilliant as well. So I think it's important to have someone close by so you can just go and see them, not in COVID times, and just cry on their shoulder if need be, or talk through anything you need to. And one of the big things that I've learned is that research is never ending. So at the end of your clinical day, you've ticked off all your appointments and you've written all your notes and you've closed system one and it's done. Research never feels like that. There's always more you could do. And that's something that I think is actually really nice to have in some ways, but it has been a challenge for me to adapt to that. Okay, next slide, please. So since my internship, it's not all been fun and games. There's definitely been some lows there as well. I applied for the PCAF in 2019. It was classed as fundable, but when they rank them in order and then they give the money away, and the money just didn't stretch to mine. So it wasn't funded. So I had a year in between funding where I was back working clinically full time. But the PCAF application wanted me to have more experience. They wanted me to get some publications. They said that's how I could improve. But that's really tricky without funding because you just have no time. So it was a lot of work on weekends and a lot of work on evenings. My systematic review, so that's the literature review I did in the internship. I then changed into a systematic review. It's its third time going for publication currently. It's not been rejected, but it keeps coming back with amendments, and it is a little bit heartbreaking, and it is a lot of work. And I think anyone would say that the bit in between the funding is really difficult. And obviously everyone's going to say COVID-19 has brought its challenges as well. But some real success. So I did have my PCAF application funded last year and I started in September. My systematic review has gone back for publication, so everyone keep their fingers crossed for me, please. I presented my internship findings at the Craniofacial Society of Great Britain and Ireland annual scientific meeting. And I've also had an abstract accepted for the Cardiff meeting, which has been delayed because of COVID. So hopefully this year. I've had ethical approval for a small study using the collective data. I started a course at University of Sheffield. I became the joint research lead for allied health professionals in my trust, which is a role that I love. So that's very much supporting other colleagues to kind of take forward their research interests. And I've supported a few internship applications, which was brilliant. And I'm also supporting 2 PCAF applications at the moment. So hopefully that will be successful as well. Okay, next slide, please. So this is my plan going forward. This is really what I'd like to think it would look like. So I'm going to do my PCAF. I'm going to, carry out some PPI, make a protocol, and then apply for the CDRF, the doctorate. And I'd love to run a feasibility study. And then postdoc, I'd like to turn that into an RCT. That's what I'd love it to look like. But if we could go to the next slide, please. This is what I think it's actually going to look like, because nothing ever goes smoothly. And we all know that, research, clinical, or just general life they're definitely going to throw some bumps in the road. They're definitely going to throw some barriers in there. So it's going to go all over the place, and I might change my plan altogether, but I think that's absolutely fine, because it's all about the journey, really. And if we just go to my last slide, please. Just a nice cliche quote for you all. I do very much believe in this, and I also, to add to the cliche, do think that research is about the journey, not the destination. So it's fine for things to change along the way. Okay, so my last slide just has my contact details. I'm more than happy to talk through. I love to hear from people and to network. So yeah, follow me on Twitter and send me an email.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was Brilliant. And your enthusiasm for clinical research really comes through, which is always just a real joy to see. I love the fact, again, that you've reiterated that research questions come from clinical practice, just from being inquisitive about what we do. And I think that that's really important to highlight to everyone. And I loved your think big. I think it's really important to think beyond the next step, but also to appreciate the next steps as you take it. So that's fantastic. We haven't got loads of time for questions, but a couple did come up. So perhaps if we can ask one now and you can respond to the other in the chat. So yes. Christine asked, obviously you started your clinical academic journey quite early on in your clinical career, actually, which is, you know, fantastic, really, that you've had that foresight and that inspiration so early. But did you have any barriers to starting out when you only had a few years of clinical practice behind you?
Yeah, I think there's still some barriers now. I'm not in a cleft team, which can be a little bit of a barrier, because obviously for our department, cleft necessarily isn't necessarily the biggest priority to my manager, so that can be a little bit of a barrier, definitely, but he's just been really, I think it's just getting your manager's support. He was really supportive of just helping me to grow, and see where that comes. And obviously I have given back to the trust a little bit now as well with my role as research lead, so yeah, there's definitely been some barriers, but I wouldn't say it came necessarily because I was early on in clinical practice. But yeah, it's a good point to make. I literally qualified, did my competencies and then applied for the internship, so I was quite early on, but no barriers in terms of my age or experience, but definitely some barriers about where I'm placed in terms of my clinical role.
Yeah, and I think that's probably universal regardless of experience, actually. I think there still aren't necessarily roles for clinical academics within clinical teams. So I think that's probably universal, you know, my experience anyway. But yes, thank you for that. That's fabulous. And like I said, there's another couple of questions in the chat. So if you can respond to them now, Hannah, that would be great.
Yeah. And
we're going to move swiftly on to James, who's going to talk to us about his project concerning mealtimes and people with dementia.
Yeah, hello, thanks very much, Catherine. Hi, everybody. And thanks, Hannah. That was a fantastic presentation. Some really, really wise words. So thank you for that. So in theory now, I am in control of these slides, unlike Chris Whitty. So yeah, and I think this is working. So this is my first slide. So just to introduce myself, my name's James. I'm a speech and language therapist specialising in elderly care. I work for Newcastle Hospitals, based at the RVI in Newcastle. And for the past 2.5 years, I've been doing a PhD on the topic of mealtimes for people with dementia living in care homes. So today I'm going to present some findings from an ethnographic study which I've done as part of that PhD. My slides are sort of advancing by themselves now, which is even cleverer, really, but I'll keep going. And just to first of all give some background to the project, and I think the reasons I'm doing it will be familiar to a lot of people on the call, really. Firstly, mealtimes are clearly important to health and quality of life, but some people with dementia need support at mealtimes, perhaps particularly people living in care homes. And so it's key that care, we're going too far now. Sorry about this, everybody. I'll try to go backwards. There we go. Bear with me. It's key that carers have skills and knowledge to look after people with dementia at mealtimes. And we regularly see fantastic examples of mealtime care in care homes. And the purpose of my project was to take what we know about good mealtime care and turn that into a training program. So the project had 3 phases. Firstly, a systematic review, then an ethnography, and then finally some co-development workshops. The systematic review synthesized evidence from published studies and guidelines on the topic of mealtime care in care homes. And then I spent some time in some care homes observing mealtimes and talking to everyone involved to find out what the real issues were in practice. And then finally, I arranged a series of workshops with key stakeholders to look at the findings and to develop a training intervention. So as I said earlier, in today's presentation, I'm going to share some findings from the ethnography. And firstly, I'll just say something about the methods. There's various definitions of ethnography, but one of the simplest and best ones I've heard is that ethnography is hanging around somewhere to find out what goes on. And so in my case, I spent several months hanging around in 2 care homes in the northeast of England. These homes were different in a couple of respects, really. One was part of a large national company. The other was part of a very small local chain. One of the homes had a relatively small number of beds, less than 40. The other had a much larger number of beds, nearly 100. But what they had in common was that both homes were registered to provide dementia care. So I recruited 95 participants to the study, including residents, care home staff, family carers, and visiting healthcare professionals. I did over 25 hours of observations in the care homes. That was at meal times mainly, but also at other times during the day. And I conducted 22 semi-structured interviews with people involved in the care of residents. I just mentioned as well that I recruited a 3rd care home to the study. I wanted to find a home that was somewhere in between the other 2 in terms of size and organisation. And I began recruitment in that home in sort of January and February last year, but then the inevitable happened, lockdown came along, and I wasn't able to go into that home in the end. But I did manage to speak to the manager. I did an interview with her to check out my preliminary findings, really. So that was really helpful. From the analysis of the observations and the interview, I identified 5 components of mealtime care. I'm going to briefly describe each of these, and then I'll drill down into one of them in particular, just to give a bit more detail. But firstly, social interaction, and I found that the way that staff interact with residents socially has an impact on meal times. So different styles of interaction were helpful at different times. So for example, jokes and, for want of a better word, banter was appropriate in some circumstances, whereas things like affection and touch were helpful in other circumstances. Let me just go back again. This is on automatic, so I don't know why, but there we go. And understanding the social dynamics between residents themselves was really important. And finally, we found that sometimes staff sat and ate with residents, and that had a really positive effect on meal times. Secondly, independence and assistance. So skilled staff would vary the amount and the type of assistance that they gave at meal times, depending on individual need. Some residents obviously needed more assistance than others, and some needed more assistance at certain times. But the best kind of assistance helped those residents to be as independent as possible. Thirdly, autonomy and best interests. So it was important for staff to know residents' preferences around meal times and support them to make decisions. But challenges arose when those preferences or those decisions were considered by others to be unwise in some way. Fourthly, managing food refusal. Now, this was a particularly challenging aspect of mealtime care. Staff had to make careful judgments about how to respond, deciding when to persist and when to withdraw, and encouraging residents to eat, but not forcing them to eat. It was important for them to consider underlying causes and to be realistic about oral intake, particularly in the cases of advanced dementia. And finally, teamwork, and we found that a close working relationship between staff really helped mealtimes to be successful. We saw this when staff shared information about residents' preferences and needs, and when they worked together to ensure that meals were served efficiently. But also staff having fun and enjoying each other's company created a really harmonious atmosphere in the dining room sometimes. But it was important that this was done in a way that was inclusive of residents. and tailored to them. So I'm going to say a bit more now about one of those components in particular, and let's choose managing food refusal. So I'm going to provide some extracts from the field notes from the observations and also from some of the interviews to illustrate some of this. So some residents were reluctant to eat and drink and resistant to attempts from staff to encourage or assist at mealtimes. Staff had a range of responses and approaches to the challenge. Some of these were successful, some of these were less successful. But what we saw was that staff often displayed really high levels of skill and sensitivity. Let me just go back again. Apologies. Yeah, high levels of skill and sensitivity in knowing how and how much to persist when encouraging residents to eat. So, for example, here's an extract from on the left from field notes from a tea time observation where a care assistant called Brenda was helping Frida, who had advanced dementia. As she offers her spoonfuls of pudding, Brenda is gentle but persistent. She calmly asks Frida to open her mouth. If Frida resists, she says, "Frida, do you not want it?" and tries again. And I spoke about this in interviews with various people. And so, for example, here's a quote from an interview with another care assistant, Cheryl, who said, "You can't make somebody eat if they don't want to eat. You can't do anything else other than try to tempt them, encourage them. We put the spoon to their lips, we'll tell them what's on the plate. We'll try to put a spoon in their hand even." As well as knowing how much to persevere, staff were often really quite problem solving in their approach. So they'd search for underlying reasons as to why a resident may have reduced oral intake compared with their normal. A quote from Noel, who was a head chef in one of the care homes, and he said, I don't just look at it saying, oh, they're not eating. It could be a certain type of behaviour, something could have upset them, the dementia could have just progressed. And, you know, I watch all the time, people change, diets change. And similarly, Margot, a care assistant in another care home, she said, you try to encourage them, or you try to work out why. I'll go back. You try to work out why. You know, there could be a simple explanation. Maybe their dentures don't fit properly or anything. Just eliminate everything, try and work it all out. And then finally, on this theme of managing food refusal, it was evident that staff felt a level of responsibility for residents' oral intake, and there was a danger sometimes of staff becoming burdened with this in an unhelpful way. So, for example, one of the nurses, he acknowledged this by saying sometimes staff can take it personally. They take it as a problem, and then, of course, what doesn't help and exaggerates everything is the fact that families are, well, are you trying her with that? Are you trying him with this and that and the other? And then Kathleen, a care assistant in the same home, she summed it up really well, I think, when she said, you just try your best. That's all you can do. If they say yes, it's a bonus, isn't it? Bear with me. If they say yes, it's a bonus, isn't it? But sometimes people don't say yes. Sometimes people can go days without nothing to eat. So that was just to give you a flavour, really, of some of the findings from the ethnographic study. Just to set it in context, I've used these findings and the findings from the systematic review to inform a series of Zoom workshops where I brought together care home staff, family carers and healthcare professionals, and we've developed a training intervention. And next, I plan to test out this intervention in care homes, and God willing, we'll be able to safely get back into care homes again before too long, hopefully. In closing, just like to acknowledge my funders, NIHR and Health Education England. Thank my supervisors, Claire Abley, Kath Exley and Joe Patterson, and everyone I met at the care homes. And if you'd like to find out more, please do get in touch. There's my details at the bottom of the screen. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, James. That was fascinating. I loved your method, ethnography. I think there's so much we can learn from what goes well, and that harks back to one of the presentations we had in the past, which was looking at paediatrics and a kind of video interaction type intervention, again, really focusing on what went well. I just wondered, how did you decide what was good? So how did you select the care homes, and what made you decide that that was an example of good practice?
Well, that's a great question. I selected the care homes. I tried to find care homes, as I said a little bit in my talk, that were kind of contrasting in some respects. So some bigger homes, some smaller homes. But I also, I don't know whether this is cheat. I don't think it's cheating. I kind of took advice on this, really. I chose homes that had at least a good rating from CQC inspection. And, you know, in some ways that might be not giving a full picture of what happens in care homes. It probably isn't. But the advice I received, which I thought was quite sensible, is that we want to see really good practice, and going into a care home that's really struggling or recently had a bad CQC inspection, that's going to kind of just create more pressure for that home if you're going in there to do a research study. So perhaps in some ways I took a shortcut or was selective about the homes that I chose, so that I had more chance of seeing good practice. But I saw all kinds of practice, really, and the interviews, I think, helped me pick apart, you know, what was kind of real practice, what was aspirational practice, and what were the reasons why that really good best practice perhaps didn't always happen in reality.
Thank you. So you've had some other lovely questions. Susan was wondering whether cultural and spiritual needs of patients came, or people with dementia, came up at all, and whether staff recognised those beliefs or needs at mealtimes.
Wow. Do you know, no one's asked that question before. So that's great, really. And cultural and spiritual needs. I don't know if it did come up a great deal. I think if it had, I would have a really quick kind of instantaneous answer to that. That's a really important point. I mean, in terms of kind of cultural and spiritual needs, the Northeast is quite a not a very diverse part of the world. So, you know, in terms of some ethnic diversity, there wasn't a huge amount of that in the care homes that I visited. But of course, that doesn't mean to say that people didn't have a whole range of cultural and spiritual needs, even if they were from a sort of a fairly uniform ethnic backgrounds. I think I'll go back to my data and have a look at that again, because I'm genuinely, it's the first time I've been asked about that.
Oh, well, we're glad to be able to challenge as well as enjoy your presentation. Thank you, Susan, for that. And if you want to contact James for any sort of dialogue as to what inspired that question, then please do. It sounds like he'd be really interested. Oh yeah, Sally is also really interested in your project, Sally Morgan, and she's interested in dysphagia in schools, so with children who've got complex needs. So there's probably some similarities there, and I think definitely, Sally, follow up on that ethnography as a method, because I just think that it sounds lovely, and I'm sure there's loads that you can learn from James's experience there. So Catherine was wondering if, going back to the ethnography as a method, did you have any difficulty in getting funding for that because you were using an ethnographic study as your method?
Well, no, I didn't really. I suppose in terms of the funding, you know, the panel would have looked at the study as a whole, which comprised various different elements, the systematic review, as I've said, and the ethnography and the workshops at the end. But my supervisors, and, you know, touching back a little bit on Hannah's talk, my supervisors were so helpful and really critical in the funding application as well, actually. So I met with them regularly to kind of put together the application. And one of my supervisors is really really expert on ethnography and qualitative research in general. So I think she probably helped me to understand that method better, because I'd not really come across it before, and to be able to write, I suppose, a persuasive application arguing for the use of that method. So that probably helped in terms of satisfying the funders, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, often with funding applications, it's whether your method is appropriate for your question and whether your question will address the clinical need, particularly for NIHR funding, isn't it? So I think there's maybe a perception that qualitative methods aren't as attractive, but I think that's definitely changing in my experience, and people are funders becoming more interested in qualitative research, so long as it's robust and rigorous, and you put enough thought into whether it's the appropriate method or not. So we're going to have to move on to Susan's presentation now, but thank you very much, James. There are some questions coming up in the chat box, so perhaps if I could ask you to refer to that while we attend